They were hidden in the dark. 12 frightened children, cold, hungry, and forgotten beneath an old house on the edge of a snowbound town. No light, no hope, until a lone German shepherd refused to look away. A deputy in a small Montana town followed that dog, and what he found will stay with you forever. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in miracles. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe no child should be left behind, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will never leave you. The wind came down from the mountains in long, cutting gusts, rolling over the frozen hills and spilling into the streets of Coldwater, Montana. Snow had been falling since morning, the fine powder hissing against windows and piling in the corners of porches. By late afternoon, the light had already thinned to the dim blue of approaching night. Coldwater was used to hard winters. Its people measured the season not in days, but in storms, and still, this one felt harsher than most. Deputy Ryan Callahan knew the rhythm of the town better than anyone. At 40 years old, he had the build of the Army MP he'd once been, tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and hair cropped short, already silvering at the edges. There was a watchfulness to him, the kind that came from years of standing between danger and the people who couldn't defend themselves. Folks here trusted Ryan, not because he talked much, he didn't, but because he acted when it mattered. It was his quiet shift, the kind where the radio mostly murmured about icy intersections and wandering deer. His cruiser rolled steadily down Pine Hollow Road past old farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys. The road thinned at the edge of town where the snow seemed deeper, less trampled. That's when he saw it. A dog sat across the street from a sagging two-story house, the kind of place no one had lived in for years. The clapboard siding was warped and faded to the color of ash. Grime clouded the windows. A porch railing leaned like it had grown tired of holding itself up. In this weather, the house looked almost swallowed by the winter gloom. But the dog, there was nothing ghostly about him. Large, solid, a German shepherd with a black and tan sable coat dulled by wet snow, he sat perfectly still, eyes locked on the front door. The wind tossed the fur along his back, but he didn't flinch. There was no leash, no collar, no human anywhere in sight. Ryan slowed the cruiser, watching. The dog didn't bark, didn't shift, didn't glance his way. It was the kind of focus Ryan had only seen in working dogs, sharp, intent, unshaken by distractions. He rolled the window down. "Hey, buddy," he called, voice carrying over the hush of snow. The shepherd's ears flicked just once, acknowledging the sound. Then he returned his gaze to the door. Ryan frowned. Most strays would have bolted or come sniffing. This one acted like the rest of the world was irrelevant compared to whatever was behind that door. He scanned the yard, snow choked the grass, and weeds bent under its weight. The path to the porch was half buried, no footprints. For a moment he thought of pulling over, checking the place, but a call crackled through the radio, a two-car slide-off on Main Street. He had to keep moving. As the cruiser pulled away, Ryan glanced once in the rearview mirror. The dog hadn't moved. Across town, in a weathered bungalow with paint peeling in strips from the siding, an older man sat hunched in front of a wood stove. George Turner was 68, his frame wiry but slowed by chronic lung problems. A lifetime as a carpenter had left his hands knotted with arthritis, but he still had the stubborn posture of a man who refused to give in. The room was dim, the firelight painting his face in restless shadows. He was waiting for his granddaughter. Mia Turner was 9 years old, small for her age, with long chestnut hair and an old red coat that had belonged to her mother. That afternoon, she'd set out to return a borrowed book to a neighbor just 2 streets over. She should have been home before the sky turned. Now the clock ticked loudly in the quiet, and the wind rattled the loose kitchen window. George coughed into his sleeve, listening for the sound of her boots on the porch. The snow outside muffled everything, and each passing minute felt heavier. Back on Pine Hollow Road, the German shepherd sat unmoving, framed by the sagging shape of the old house. The last of the light slid away, leaving him in shadow, but still he stared at the door, as if the night could not begin until whatever he was waiting for had happened. The morning after his first sighting, Ryan Callahan's patrol began earlier than usual. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the streets glazed with a hard crust of snow that crunched under every step. The sky was pale and brittle, sunlight sharp enough to make the frost glitter. Coldwater looked deceptively calm, but Ryan knew Better Winter here was a predator that waited for mistakes. He'd told himself there was no reason to go down Pine Hollow Road again. There were other routes, other duties. Yet when the cruiser's tires hummed over the plowed surface of Main Street, his hands steered almost without asking toward the edge of town. As he turned onto Pine Hollow, the breath he didn't realize he was holding eased out. The dog was still there. Same spot, same posture, amber eyes fixed on the front door of the abandoned house. Snow had drifted deeper around him overnight, halfway up his legs, yet he stood with the stillness of carved stone. No collar, no tags, no food dish or water bowl nearby. If he belonged to someone, they were invisible. Ryan slowed the cruiser and parked across the street. The cold hit him instantly when he stepped out, a deep, needling chill that worked its way through his gloves. The crunch of his boots in the snow was the only sound until he spoke. "Morning, partner," he said quietly. The German shepherd's head turned, just slightly, and their eyes met. It wasn't fear in that gaze, nor the hopeful glance of a dog expecting a treat. It was a measured acknowledgement, as if the animal was deciding whether Ryan was worth trusting. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the shepherd looked back to the house. Ryan studied him closer now. The dog's fur was thick but not well groomed, the edges of his ears roughened by frostbite from older winters. The faint scar along his right flank caught the sunlight, a thin, pale line in the dark fur. His frame was lean, but his posture radiated a restrained energy, the way working dogs did when they were holding themselves back from action until given a command. Ryan knelt slightly in the snow. No collar, no leash, no owner in sight. "So what's keeping you here, huh?" He scanned the sagging porch, the boarded-up windows, the roof line that seemed one storm away from collapse. He'd been in this neighborhood before. There were stories about this house. Some kids swore they'd heard footsteps inside at night. Others dared each other to touch the front door and run. But every time the sheriff's department had checked, it had been empty. Or so they'd thought. Ryan's radio crackled, but it was just dispatch confirming road clearances. He stayed there a moment longer, then stood, brushing snow from his knees. "Guess you're not ready to let me in on your secret yet," he murmured. The shepherd's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Across the street, behind those grimy windows and weathered walls, the air was stale and cold. Down in the basement, where no sunlight reached, the temperature was even lower. Mia Turner sat huddled against a rough wooden wall, knees pulled to her chest beneath her too-thin coat. Her hair was tangled, cheeks flushed from cold, and her small hands clutched the arm of another child, a boy of about 7 with hollow eyes and a torn sweater. There were others in the dimness, at least 6 children she could see, all keeping close to one another. The floor was hard-packed dirt, cold seeping through their clothes. Somewhere in the dark, water dripped steadily from a leaky pipe, the sound loud in the otherwise hushed room. She had learned quickly not to speak unless necessary. The man who brought them here didn't like noise. She didn't know how long it had been since she'd last seen daylight. When she'd been pulled off the street, she'd been carrying the book her neighbor had lent her. It was gone now. Sometimes faint sounds came from above boards creaking, the faint thump of movement. But today, as the wind howled outside, she heard something else. The crunch of boots in snow, muffled but close. Her heart skipped, and she tilted her head, straining to hear. A deep, distant bark came, just once, then silence again. The other children shifted but didn't speak. She didn't know whose dog it was or why it mattered, but for a moment, it broke the endless sameness of their captivity. Outside, Ryan lingered another few seconds before heading back to his cruiser. His boots left a crisp trail in the untouched snow. As he pulled away, the dog's reflection caught in his side mirror, still watching, still unmoved. Ryan tightened his grip on the wheel. He didn't have proof. He didn't have a warrant. But he did have a gut feeling, the kind honed from years on the job and from lessons learned the hard way. And his gut told him this was not over. By the third morning, winter had stopped pretending to be anything less than merciless. A wall of white swept over Coldwater, driven by winds that screamed through the narrow streets and made even the pine trees bend. Snow flew sideways, stinging any exposed skin, and visibility had shrunk to no more than the length of a pickup truck. Ryan Callahan had been out since dawn, checking the few roads still passable, chains biting into the ice under his tires. The radio was full of static, Dispatch's voice cutting in and out between bursts of wind. Most folks in town had hunkered down for the day. You didn't go out in weather like this unless you had to. He didn't intend to go down Pine Hollow Road, not in this mess. But as the cruiser's wipers fought to keep the windshield clear, his hands seemed to turn the wheel of their own accord. And there it was, barely visible through the swirling snow, a dark shape against the sagging porch of the old house. The shepherd hadn't moved. His fur was soaked through, heavy with ice clinging in tiny beads, and his body trembled with cold, but he sat exactly where he had the day before, amber eyes fixed on that same door. For a moment, Ryan just sat in the cruiser, the engine rumbling, watching through the blur of falling snow. He knew the signs of an animal reaching the edge hypothermia could set in fast at these temperatures. But what struck him wasn't the danger the dog was in. It was that even now, half frozen, he hadn't left his post. Ryan shoved open his door, the wind immediately trying to shove it back, and stepped into the storm. Snow caught in the seams of his coat and filled his collar in seconds. "All right, buddy, that's enough," he muttered, crouching low as he reached the shepherd. Up close he could see the dog's breath coming in quick bursts, each puff turning to steam in the frigid air. He reached for the thick ruff of fur at the dog's neck. "Let's get you warm." The shepherd didn't resist being guided toward the cruiser, but halfway there he stopped, muscles tensing. He glanced back toward the house, then dug in his paws against the snow, pulling lightly but insistently toward the porch. Ryan frowned. "You really don't want to leave, do you?" The dog whined, a sound low and urgent, and pulled again toward the front steps. Snow clung to his whiskers, and his ears flattened against the wind, but the set of his shoulders was as clear a signal as any words. Something in there mattered to him. Across town, in a dim little kitchen smelling faintly of wood smoke and dust, George Turner sat hunched over his landline telephone, pressing the receiver hard against his ear. The wind rattled the siding outside and hissed against the windows. His voice was hoarse from both age and worry. "Hello? Sheriff's office? My granddaughter. She's not back. Mia Turner, 9 years old. Small..." The voice on the other end crackled and broke apart under the interference of the storm. "Can't repeat slow down address again." George gritted his teeth, repeating it louder, coughing midway through. Static answered him, swallowing half his words. He slammed the receiver down, then picked it up again, trying once more. Nothing. The storm had the lines in a chokehold. He pressed a hand to his chest, breathing hard. Mia had never been gone this long without telling him. He didn't have the strength to go out looking himself, not in this weather. All he could do was hope someone heard him through the storm. Back on Pine Hollow Road, Ryan eased the car door open, coaxing the shepherd inside. The dog hesitated at the threshold, turning his head once more toward the house before climbing in, his paws leaving wet prints on the rubber floor mat. Ryan cranked the heat, the vents blasting warm air into the small space. The shepherd shook himself once, sending a spray of meltwater across the dashboard, then settled into a tense sit, eyes never leaving the view of the porch through the windshield. Ryan studied him for a beat. "You're really not going to let this go, are you?" The shepherd's gaze didn't flicker. The wind outside howled, rattling the cruiser, but in the cab it was warm, the air steaming around their breath. Ryan put the car in gear, pulled forward a few feet, then stopped again. The dog's head turned sharply, watching the house grow smaller through the back glass. And then came the sound, a single, sharp whine. It wasn't a plea for comfort. It was an alert. Ryan's fingers drummed once on the wheel. His training told him to trust patterns, and this was no random animal behavior. He'd seen military dogs refuse to leave a scene when they knew something was wrong, even if it meant risking themselves. He put the cruiser in park, grabbed his radio, and tried calling dispatch. The reply came back thin, distorted by the storm. "Roads closing limited units." He glanced at the shepherd, who met his eyes in the rearview mirror as if confirming his decision. "All right," Ryan muttered, pulling on his gloves again. "Show me." He stepped out into the wind, the shepherd hopping down after him, snow crunching under his paws. The dog trotted ahead, toward the porch, his gait quick but steady despite the cold. Ryan followed, boots sinking into the drifted snow, until they stood at the foot of the steps. The dog paused there, muscles coiled, then looked back at Ryan with a low woof of breath, like a signal. Above the roar of the wind, Ryan thought he heard something, faint, muffled, almost imagined. A thump? A scrape? He couldn't be sure, but between the storm, the empty street, and the unwavering posture of the dog, the feeling in his gut solidified. Someone was inside. The storm had eased by mid-morning, leaving behind a brittle white silence. The streets of Coldwater were muffled under a thick blanket of snow, the sky a washed-out gray. Ryan Callahan stood beside his cruiser on Pine Hollow Road, his boots crunching into the crust as his breath fogged in the cold air. Shadow, the German shepherd, sat at his side, ears pricked, eyes locked on the house that had become the center of Ryan's growing unease. The previous day's encounter had gnawed at him through the night. He'd replayed the scene over and over, Shadow's resistance to leaving, the faint noises barely audible over the wind. Ryan wasn't the kind of man to ignore his instincts, especially not when they were this persistent. He'd called in backup that morning. Officer Daniel Vega was the first to arrive, steering his department-issued SUV carefully through the narrowed, snow-packed street. Vega was 32, wiry but fit, with dark hair cut close to the scalp and sharp brown eyes that missed little. A former state trooper, he carried himself with a mix of confidence and restless energy, always ready to move. His humor was quick, but when the job called for focus, he was a man who locked in and didn't waver. He stepped out, zipping up his heavy parka as his boots hit the snow. "So this is the place?" he asked, scanning the sagging facade. "This is it," Ryan said, glancing down at Shadow. "And this is our guide." As if on cue, Shadow rose to his feet and trotted ahead, paws punching into the snow. He bounded up the porch steps, his nails scraping the worn wood, and immediately began clawing at the warped front door. The sound was urgent, deliberate, not the restless scratching of a bored dog, but the insistent raking of an animal trying to get someone's attention. His bark followed, sharp and resonant in the frozen air. Ryan and Vega exchanged a glance. "That's not random," Vega muttered. "No," Ryan agreed. He stepped closer to the door, leaning in slightly. For a moment, all he heard was the wind through the bare branches overhead. Then, faint but distinct, came another sound, a muffled thud, followed by what might have been a whimper. Ryan's jaw tightened. "You hear that?" Vega nodded. "Not the kind of noise an empty house makes." Inside, deep in the basement, the group of children stirred at the sound. Mia Turner, her knees drawn up under her coat, lifted her head. The barking was different from the footsteps and occasional banging they'd heard before. It was closer, sharper, more alive. The boy beside her, pale and hollow-eyed, whispered something she couldn't quite hear, but she saw the flicker of hope in his expression. She pressed her chilled hands together, the sound of the dog echoing through the boards above like a distant promise. Back on the porch, Ryan's mind was already moving. "We need to get inside, but we don't have probable cause for a forced entry. Not yet." Vega frowned. "So what's the move?" Ryan stepped back into the snow, pulling out his phone. "We get the paperwork. If there's someone in there who doesn't want to be found, I'm not giving them time to disappear." Shadow paced at the top of the steps, glancing back at Ryan with a sharp whine before returning his gaze to the door. His tail was stiff, his weight forward, every line of his body reading like an arrow pointing to the heart of the house. It took time longer than Ryan liked to get through to the judge on call. The storm had slowed everything, even phone connections were patchy. But Ryan's voice was steady as he laid out what he had. 3 consecutive days of the same dog stationed at the property in extreme conditions, the animal's repeated attempts to draw attention to the house, the unexplained noises both he and another officer had heard from inside. He left out nothing, not even the gut feeling that had been clawing at him since that first sighting. The judge hesitated, asked for confirmation from dispatch, and finally gave the word. A search warrant would be issued, though in this weather it would take a bit for the paperwork to reach them. When Ryan ended the call, Vega was watching the house with a kind of quiet intensity. "Feels wrong," Vega said. "Yeah," Ryan replied. "Feels like something that's been wrong for a long time." Shadow barked again, one sharp note, as if in agreement. They didn't go inside yet, but they didn't leave either. Ryan and Vega circled the property, noting the warped siding, the cracked foundation, the snowdrifts piled against the back door. No footprints disturbed the snow in the yard. If there was movement inside, it wasn't coming from anyone stepping out. As they came around to the front again, Shadow was still at the door, paws braced against the wood, chest heaving with each bark. The sound seemed to echo into the house, traveling through walls and floors until it reached the basement. In the dim, cold space below, Mia closed her eyes and listened. Each bark was like a knock against the door of the world outside. She could almost feel the vibrations in the floor. For the first time in days, she let herself imagine that someone might be looking for them, that this wasn't how their story would end. By the time the warrant arrived, the pale daylight was already fading toward evening, the cold sharpening in the air. Ryan Callahan stood with the folded document in his gloved hand, its official seal catching what little light there was. Snow creaked under the boots of the small team assembled Officer Daniel Vega, 2 uniformed deputies from the county, and Marla Jensen, the department's medic, a stocky woman in her mid-40s with weathered hands and a face marked by both kindness and the unflinching calm of someone who'd seen too many emergencies. She wore a dark beanie pulled low, her breath steady in the frosty air as she checked her kit. Shadow stood poised on the porch, as if he'd been waiting all day for this moment. The wind tugged at the fur along his shoulders, but his stance was alert and forward, tail stiff, eyes never leaving the warped front door. "All right," Ryan said, his voice firm. "We go in clean and careful. Vega, you're on my right. Deputies, clear each room as we pass. Marla, stay close but behind us until it's secure." The key from the evidence box wouldn't have worked here. There was no lock to pick, only a stubborn, swollen door frame. Vega braced his shoulder against it while Ryan worked the pry bar into the seam. The wood gave with a groan, the smell that spilled out dry and stale, like a room long sealed from the sun. The house was as lifeless as its exterior suggested dust-thick air, sagging furniture, walls warped from years without heat. Their boots left sharp prints on the wooden floorboards. They moved through the rooms, the creak of each step echoing in the silence. Shadow didn't hesitate. The moment they cleared the kitchen, he trotted to a narrow doorway at the rear, a faint draft curling out from beneath it. Ryan followed as the shepherd pawed at the door, nails scraping against flaking paint. Vega shone his flashlight over the frame. "Looks like a cellar entrance." Ryan worked the latch. The door stuck, then swung open with a groan, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was colder, denser, edged with the faint smell of mildew and something harder to name, metallic, stale. "Shadow, heel," Ryan ordered softly. The dog stayed just ahead of him, paws steady on the steps. Their flashlights cut through the dark, revealing stone walls braced by old beams. The floor was uneven, patches of dirt and worn concrete underfoot. A thin drip echoed from somewhere deeper in the shadows. Shadow's pace slowed as he reached a heavy metal door at the far side. The surface was scratched and scuffed, the hinges rusted but sturdy. A thick padlock hung at the latch, but what struck Ryan most was that the bolt was on the outside. Whoever had built this hadn't intended to keep something out, it was to keep someone in. Vega's mouth tightened. "That's not good." Ryan signaled for one of the deputies, a tall man named Harris with a battering ram slung over his shoulder. Harris had the rangy build of a ranch hand and a reputation for being calm under pressure. He set the ram against the latch, counted off, and with a sharp swing the lock clanged and gave way. The door swung inward. The first thing Ryan saw were eyes, wide, wary, reflecting the beam of his flashlight. Then shapes began to emerge, small figures huddled together on thin cots or bare ground, clothes hanging off thin shoulders, hair unkempt, faces pale. 12 children, their ages ranging from maybe 5 to early teens. They didn't make a sound, but the weight of their gaze was enough to still the room. "Mia," Ryan called softly, scanning. Near the back wall, a slight girl with chestnut hair and a red coat lifted her head. Her eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion, held a spark of recognition at the sound of a voice that wasn't their captor's. She pushed herself up slowly, swaying a little, before a smaller boy at her side helped her to her feet. Marla stepped forward now, kneeling to meet the children's eyes. "You're safe," she said gently, her voice cutting through the frozen stillness. "We're here to take you home." Shadow padded into the room, his movements slow, deliberate. He approached Mia first, lowering his head so they were eye to eye. She reached out with trembling fingers, touching the fur at his neck. For the first time in what felt like forever, her lips curved into a small, shaky smile. Above ground, word was already spreading through the radio net. At the Turner house, George had been pacing the narrow living room, the fire in the stove burning low. The knock at the door startled him so much he almost tripped on the braided rug. A paramedic named Colin Myers, a broad-shouldered man with a wind-reddened face, stood there, his reflective jacket dusted with snow. Mr. Turner, I'm here from the sheriff's department. Your granddaughter, Mia, she's safe. She's on her way to medical right now. George's breath caught, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe for balance. She's alive? Yes, sir, Colin said, his tone steady but warm. She's weak, but she's going to be all right. George's knees nearly gave out, but he stayed upright, both hands clutching the worn wool scarf Mia had left behind days ago. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Thank God." The tears came unbidden, tracking down his lined cheeks as he pressed the scarf to his face. Back in the basement, Ryan and Vega began guiding the children toward the stairs. Marla wrapped them in blankets from her pack, her hands quick but gentle. Shadow moved alongside the line, occasionally brushing his flank against a leg or pausing when a child's hand sought him for comfort. When Mia reached the steps, Ryan offered her his gloved hand. "Your grandpa's waiting for you," he told her. She clung to his fingers as she took the first step upward, her eyes flicking back toward Shadow. The shepherd gave a single, slow wag of his tail, as if promising he'd be right behind her. The basement smelled of damp earth and stale air, the stone walls sweating from the difference between the freezing temperature outside and the stale, breath-warmed atmosphere within. Ryan Callahan had just finished helping the last child onto the steps when Shadow's head suddenly lifted. The German shepherd's ears pricked sharply, his entire body shifting into a taut, forward-pointing line. His nose worked the air in quick bursts, eyes flicking toward the far end of the room where a stack of warped wooden crates leaned against the wall. Ryan knew that look. He'd seen it before in combat dogs when they locked onto a scent trail. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, following Shadow's gaze. Vega, standing guard near the base of the stairs, caught the shift in Ryan's attention and stepped closer. Shadow padded over to the crates, sniffing intently, then pawed at them, nails scraping against the old wood. Ryan and Vega exchanged a glance. Together they hauled the crates aside, revealing a narrow wooden hatch, its edges worn and stained. A faint draft leaked from the seam, carrying with it the earthy scent of freshly disturbed soil. "This wasn't on the floor plan," Vega muttered. Ryan crouched and unlatched the hatch. The wood creaked open to reveal a steep, dirt-packed ramp sloping down into darkness. The beam of Ryan's flashlight stretched along the cramped tunnel, the rough walls shored up with old timbers. The air inside was heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that set his teeth on edge. He looked at Vega. "Get the kids topside. Marla stays with them. Harris covers the front and calls for another unit." Vega nodded and turned toward the stairs. As the children passed, one of them, a boy of about 8 with a shock of sandy hair and a sweater 2 sizes too big, paused to wrap his thin arms around Shadow's neck. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracked but earnest. Shadow stood still, his gaze fixed on the tunnel, his muscles tense under the boy's hands. Ryan caught the boy's name in the medic's notes later. Ben and knew he'd remember the sight. Ryan descended into the tunnel, Shadow slipping in just ahead of him. The walls seemed to close in, the beams low enough that Ryan had to hunch as he moved. Their breath echoed in the confined space, mixing with the distant, uneven thud of footsteps ahead. Whoever was down here was moving fast but not panicked. They knew this route. The tunnel twisted, then opened into a broader section where crude shelves lined the walls, holding dusty jars, cracked buckets, and a scattering of tools. Ryan's flashlight swept across the dirt, catching the impressions of recent boots leading deeper. Shadow surged forward, nose low, tail stiff, his pace accelerating. A few turns later, the light caught a figure ahead, a man in a heavy canvas coat and knit cap, glancing over his shoulder. His face was gaunt, pale under the grime, and his eyes narrowed when they locked on Ryan's light. Without hesitation, he bolted. "Sheriff's Department, stop where you are!" Ryan's voice echoed, but the man ducked around a bend. Shadow lunged ahead, his claws scrabbling against the packed earth for traction. Ryan followed, the beam of his flashlight bouncing with each stride. They cleared the bend, and Shadow closed the distance in seconds, launching forward in a blur of black and tan. His jaws clamped onto the man's forearm just as he reached a wooden ladder leading up to a snow-fringed exit hatch. The man shouted in pain, twisting, but Shadow held firm, his weight dragging the suspect down to his knees. Ryan was on him a moment later, pinning his free arm and snapping cuffs around his wrists. The suspect's breath came in ragged clouds, his eyes darting between Ryan and the dog. "You don't know what you're doing," he spat, his voice hoarse. "I know enough," Ryan said evenly, hauling him to his feet. Shadow released his grip on command but stayed close, his teeth bared in a silent warning. The hatch above creaked open, letting in a slash of cold light and the silhouette of one of the county deputies waiting topside. Snow swirled into the tunnel as they pushed the man up and out, his boots slipping against the icy edge. When Ryan and Shadow emerged, they were at the edge of the forest behind the property. The tree line was dense here, the ground uneven under a fresh dusting of snow. The deputy led the suspect toward a waiting SUV, while Ryan knelt beside Shadow, running a hand over his neck. "Good work, partner," he said quietly. Shadow's amber eyes remained sharp, scanning the trees as if ready for another pursuit. From the front of the house, the faint sound of children's voices reached them, higher now, threaded with relief. The wind carried it like a fragile thread through the cold air. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound, and for the first time since they'd gone underground, his posture eased just slightly. The convoy of emergency vehicles moved slowly through Coldwater's snow-packed streets, their lights casting flashes of red and blue against the white drifts. Inside the lead ambulance, the heater blasted warm air toward the bundled children, their small faces pale but beginning to thaw in the glow. Ryan Callahan drove behind in his cruiser, Shadow curled on a blanket in the back seat. The German shepherd's eyes were half-lidded, his breathing slow but steady. Steam rose faintly from his damp coat as the heat worked its way into him. The hospital in Coldwater wasn't large, only 2 stories, a mix of brick and weathered siding, but it was warm and well-run. Inside, the staff moved with brisk efficiency, guided by Dr. Emily Carter, the hospital's lead pediatrician. Emily was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with streaks of silver through her chestnut hair, and the kind of steady, clear-eyed presence that could calm a frightened child with a glance. Years earlier, she'd volunteered in disaster zones, an experience that left her both compassionate and quietly fierce when it came to protecting the vulnerable. She was waiting in the lobby when the first paramedics wheeled the children in. "Let's get them into triage 2 at a time," she instructed, her voice calm but urgent. Nurses peeled away coats and blankets, checking fingers, toes, and vitals, wrapping each child in fresh layers of warmth. Ryan guided Shadow toward a quieter corner of the reception area. The dog walked steadily despite the hours in the cold, his head turning slightly as he took in the unfamiliar smells. In the exam room, Dr. Alan Morris, the town's only veterinarian, was already waiting. Alan was in his late 50s with a slight stoop from years of bending over exam tables. He had a gentle manner with animals, speaking to them in low tones that seemed to carry meaning. Alan ran practiced hands over Shadow's coat, checking ears, paws, and heartbeat. "Good muscle tone," he murmured, "and no signs of frostbite, though he's been pushing his limits. Mild hypothermia, nothing we can't fix with rest and warmth." He glanced at Ryan. "He'll be fine, but he needs downtime." Ryan crouched beside the table, meeting Shadow's amber gaze. "You hear that? You're going to be fine." He rested a hand against the dog's shoulder, the damp fur cool against his palm. "You did something no one else could have done." Shadow blinked slowly, his tail giving one quiet thump against the table's edge. In the pediatric wing, George Turner stepped out of the elevator, leaning heavily on his cane. His wiry frame seemed even thinner under the loose brown coat he wore, but his pace quickened when he saw a nurse approaching with Mia. The girl was bundled in a hospital blanket, her hair brushed out of its tangles, though the shadows under her eyes hadn't faded. "Grandpa!" Mia's voice cracked on the first syllable. She broke into a run, the blanket trailing behind her, and collided with George's open arms. George's own breath hitched as he folded her against him, one hand cupping the back of her head. "I've got you, sweetheart," he whispered. His eyes shone, but he didn't loosen his grip, as if letting go might undo the miracle in front of him. For a long moment, they stood like that, both crying softly into each other's shoulders. A nurse with sandy hair and a reassuring smile, Lena Brooks, new to Coldwater but already known for her calm in a crisis, gently touched George's arm. "Let's get her to a bed, Mr. Turner. We'll keep her close to you while we finish her checkup." George nodded, his hand never leaving Mia's as they followed Lena into a room. Ryan stepped into the doorway, Shadow at his side. Mia's eyes lit up when she saw the dog, and she reached a small hand toward him. Shadow crossed the space in a few strides, lowering his head to her level. She stroked his fur with slow, careful fingers, the corners of her mouth lifting in a smile that was faint but genuine. Ryan caught George's eye. "She's a strong one," he said. George's voice was hoarse. "She gets it from her mother. And maybe from her new friend here. He gave Shadow a grateful nod. As the bustle of the hospital continued around them, nurses moving between rooms, the hum of equipment, the muffled voices of doctors, Ryan felt the weight that had been pressing on his chest ease just slightly. The danger was over, at least for now. The children were safe, Shadow was resting, and George had Mia back in his arms. Outside, the winter night pressed against the windows, but inside, warmth and light held their ground. A year had passed since the storm, but winter had returned to Coldwater with the same quiet forced snow falling in slow spirals, the air sharp and clean, the pines along the ridges bowing under the weight of white. The old house on Pine Hollow Road was gone, reduced to a flat, snow-covered lot where only the faintest outline in the ground hinted at where it had stood. In its place, the town council had ordered the space cleared, a deliberate erasure of the darkness that had once hidden there. The man responsible, Paul Kendrew, a wiry, hollow-eyed figure whose court appearance had been as cold as his crimes, was now serving a lengthy sentence in a federal facility. The trial had been swift. Testimony from the rescued children, the forensic evidence from the basement, and the discovery of the escape tunnel had left the defense with nothing to stand on. In the months since, life in Coldwater had found its rhythm again, though certain places and moments carried the weight of memory. The hospital staff still remembered the night the children arrived. The sheriff's department kept a framed photograph of the rescue in their lobby, a candid shot of Shadow, snow clinging to his fur, amber eyes steady under the porch light, and Shadow himself had traded the cold street for the warmth of Ryan Callahan's home. Ryan's place sat on the edge of town, a modest single-story house with cedar siding and a wide front porch. The yard backed onto a stretch of woods, giving Shadow plenty of room to roam. At first, the German Shepherd had paced the property with the same silent vigilance he'd shown outside the abandoned house, sleeping light and waking at the smallest sound. But over time, his posture had eased. The taut lines of his body gave way to a calm strength, the kind of watchfulness that came from security, not desperation. Ryan had made the adoption official 6 months after the rescue. The paperwork had been a formality. The bond between man and dog had been sealed in snow and shadow long before. To the town, Shadow was no longer just a stray with a mysterious past. He was Coldwater's guardian, the dog who wouldn't look away. On this particular Saturday, the porch boards creaked under the weight of 2 visitors. Mia Turner, now 10, bounded up the steps with the eager energy of someone who had reclaimed her freedom in full. Her hair was longer, and she wore a red knitted hat pulled low over her ears, the pom-pom bobbing as she ran. In her gloved hands, she carried a small tin decorated with faded holly leaves. Behind her, George Turner climbed at a more measured pace, leaning on his cane but smiling in a way that lit the lines of his weathered face. His coat was buttoned against the cold, and his other hand gripped a paper bag that gave off the faint scent of cinnamon. The screen door opened, and Ryan stepped out, his breath misting in the cold air. He was dressed in a thick flannel shirt and jeans, a wool beanie pulled down over his short-cropped hair. "Afternoon," he greeted, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Brought something for your partner," George said, holding up the bag. Mia didn't wait for permission. She darted to the far end of the porch where Shadow lay, stretched out in a patch of pale winter sunlight. His head lifted at the sound of her boots, and his tail thumped against the boards. Mia knelt, opening the tin to reveal a neat stack of bone-shaped biscuits, each one slightly uneven, as if shaped by hand. "Grandpa helped me make these," she said, offering one. Shadow took it gently from her fingers, his eyes soft but bright. Ryan leaned against the porch rail, watching the exchange. "Careful," he said with a small smile. "He'll get used to you spoiling him every week." "That's the plan," Mia replied, grinning. She reached out to scratch the spot behind Shadow's bent ear, the one that always made him lean into her touch. George settled into the chair nearest the door, his cane resting against the arm. "Hard to believe it's been a year," he said quietly, looking out at the snow-dusted yard. "Feels longer, in some ways. Shorter in others." Ryan nodded, his gaze following Shadow as the dog rested his head in Mia's lap. "Time does that," he said. "But the important part is what's here now." The afternoon passed easily. George and Ryan traded stories while Mia tossed a small ball down the porch steps for Shadow to chase. The shepherd moved with fluid power, bounding through the snow and returning each time with a gentle grip on the toy. When the sun dipped low and the cold deepened, Mia curled against Shadow's side, her laughter carried on little clouds of breath. As the Turners prepared to leave, George shook Ryan's hand with a grip still firm despite the years. "You've given him a home," he said, nodding toward Shadow, "and he's given this town a little more faith." Ryan watched as they made their way down the walk, Mia waving until the turn in the drive hid her from view. He turned back to see Shadow sitting at the edge of the porch, eyes on the yard, tail sweeping once against the boards. It was the same position Ryan had first seen him in, still, watchful, but now his gaze was on the woods and the road beyond, not on an empty, rotting house. This time, he wasn't guarding a secret in the dark. He was guarding the people who were his. In the quiet of that final winter afternoon, Shadow's story reminds us that miracles are not always loud or wrapped in lightning and thunder. Sometimes they come on four legs, wrapped in fur, standing silently in the cold until help arrives. I believe God places protectors in our path, people and animals, when we need them most, even if we do not yet recognize them. Just as Shadow refused to look away, we are called to stand watch over one another in our daily lives, to notice the quiet cries for help that others might miss. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe for more stories of faith and courage, and join me in praying that God blesses every viewer with the protection and love they need. If you believe that no child should ever be left behind and that God works through even the smallest of his creatures, type Amen in the comments.